Welcome to My on Mondays, an explorative approach to the possessive my through narratives, art, and sound. Each Monday brings a new creation and unique perspective. My on Mondays is brought to you by MING Studios, a contemporary art space and international artist residency program dedicated to the exhibition, experience, and exploration of arts and culture. Along with exhibiting artists from around the world, MING also serves the community by hosting innovative programs including performances, workshops, screenings, readings, artist talks, and other cultural activities. For more information, or if you'd like to participate in My on Mondays, you can visit our website at mingstudios.org. Hello and welcome to My on Mondays. Today is a continuation of our Disappearing World series where we discuss things that are either endangered or being lost due to issues such as climate change, development and gentrification, or simply time. My guest is Pius Akumbu, a senior researcher at LLACAN, the Language and Culture Research Unit of the French National Center for Scientific Research and INaLCO University, that specializes in the study of languages and cultures of Africa. Before joining LLACAN, Pius was a visiting professor at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Previously, he was an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the University of Hamburg from 2019 to 2021. Before leaving his native Cameroon, Pius taught linguistics courses at the universities of Buea and Bamenda. He received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Yaoundé I. His research focuses on the documentation and description of Grassfields Bantu languages of Cameroon, including his mother tongue, Kejom, also known as Babanki, which is endangered. He is an ELDP grant recipient and a depositor at the Endangered Languages Archive. Additionally, Pius has been a language mentor for the Endangered Languages Project since November 2022. I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about the Kejom language because I had never heard of it before. And indigenous languages are kind of I have a soft spot for them. It's something that I find really interesting. So since I had never heard of the Kejom or Babanki language before, I'm sure most of our listeners have not as well. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the language?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Let me first of all talk about the language. To say that Kejom is the name that we call the language, the speakers of the language call it Kejom, and the administrative name is Babanki.
Okay.
So to make that distinction clear. This is a language that is spoken in the northwest region of Cameroon. Linguistically, it is a Grassfields language, specifically a central ring Grassfields language.
Okay.
And there are estimates say there are somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 speakers. It's hard to tell the exact number because there haven't really been proper census over the years. So we have just those estimates. And personally, I was born and raised in Kejom, in one of the Kejom villages. There are actually two villages where Kejom is spoken. So I was born and raised in one. And I think I moved from the village for the first time when I was 13. And this was to go to a nearby town for secondary school.
Okay.
So, yeah, I grew up speaking that language. And I eventually studied linguistics. By chance, I eventually studied linguistics, and so I continue to work on the language. Currently, I work at the French National Research Center, one of its labs that is called LLACAN, which is Langage, Langues et Culture d'Afrique, and we are based in Paris. And I just continued to work on African languages, including Kejom, which is my mother tongue.
Was Kejom the only language that you spoke in your village?
It's normally the main language of the village. When I was growing up, this was the only language I spoke. Mm-hmm. Well, this was nearly half a century ago, and Pidgin English was just encroaching then into the village. Okay. So yeah, many young people at that time were not able to speak Pidgin because it was just quite new. I only learned Pidgin when I started school, so alongside English when I started school.
I guess that was my question. So when you started to learn English when you were 13, when you moved to the other town to
school. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But otherwise, Kejom was the only language, the main language of the community, because I mean, Kejom happens to be in one of the multilingual. Well, Africa in general there are lots of multilingual communities, and so it's very possible that you find people speaking other indigenous languages, depending on whether they have come from other villages or they have relatives in other villages. So it's possible to find several languages in a community. But I would say Kejom was and still is the main language of the Kejom people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so that sort of leads me to my next question. There are many native languages still spoken all over Africa, and I've spent a lot of time in Ghana, and I lived in Accra, and there were several languages spoken within Accra, and people tended to speak each other's languages as well, depending on the language. But most of the people that I knew spoke a minimum of 2 languages, and quite often 3 or 4. And so this program, we're talking specifically about endangered languages. I'm curious what it is about the Kejom language that makes it susceptible.
Yeah. You can say that many languages are still spoken in Africa, especially if you compare the African situation to that of the US or Canada. Yet, I think that many languages in Africa are also endangered, but that is due to different kinds of factors than maybe you would see elsewhere in the world. The reasons for why these languages are endangered, I think the difference may be in that, even if some of these factors are shared. I know that, and I think that in Africa, language endangerment is linked to colonization, to globalization, coupled with local factors. And these local factors may include misguided government policies, And this is not something I want to go into. I will not want to go into the terrible effects of colonization on African languages and cultures. But I should just mention that the less widely spoken languages, such as Kejom, are more severely threatened than those more widely spoken.
Yeah.
The Ghanaian situation, is, as you say, is much more like what you see across the continent. You may see major languages like Akan, Twi spoken, and many people speak those.
Yeah.
But you may not be aware that most of those people probably have abandoned their own little-known languages or their own little languages in order to speak these languages of wider communication.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And so you go away with the impression that people speak the languages, yes, but I think it's not at the same rate that it could be if people normally spoke their little-known languages. So I should say I grew up speaking Kejom, as I just said earlier, and witnessing many cultural events, such as traditional weddings, But these are no longer conducted at the same scale today.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of bedtime stories which I grew up listening to from elderly persons, they are no longer told to children today.
Oh my goodness, that's such a loss.
Yeah, because you see, the children they either have homework from school to do, or they have Android phones to play with.
Wow, yeah.
And the parents may be watching TV. You can imagine. So the opportunity to tell those bedtime stories has kind of really reduced significantly.
Oh my goodness, I hadn't even thought about the stories, but I find that incredibly sad.
Yeah. So, for reasons like this, you see that the Kejom language used in specialized cultural domains, right, is being lost. And this loss is alongside the loss of these cultural practices themselves. And so young people have no chance to acquire or even to learn the language.
Yeah.
So, at a glance, one may say that the Kejom language or many other languages in Africa are not endangered. But the reality is not that simple, because as I said, many young people are in school, they are learning in English or in French or Spanish or Portuguese, depending on which part of Africa they find themselves. And it is clear to them that the language they need is this foreign language, this foreign language. And they need this language to succeed in school, to find jobs later, and those who are not in school need other languages of wider communication to do business or to interact in the larger socio-linguistic context. And little languages like Kejom, they do not have apparent functions, beyond use in homes.
Yeah.
And so these little languages, these endangered languages are not empowered. They are not empowered by the governments in any way.
Yeah.
So how do you convince young people or even their parents that their language is useful, when they actually see that they need other languages to succeed?
Yeah.
And I think to even make it worse, you see social media comes in other languages, not in those endangered languages. You will not have social media content available in those little languages. And how do you get young people's interest if they cannot, do TikTok, WhatsApp, and so on in those local languages, in those endangered languages? So it's very likely that you find that young people have negative attitudes about their local, their indigenous languages. People mostly have local attitudes.
Yeah.
And which is different from the attitudes they have about the lingua francas. Maybe this is still happening where in school, pupils or students they are not encouraged, they are not rewarded for speaking their local language.
Yeah.
In fact, in some instances, they are discouraged or even punished.
Yeah. So they don't see the benefit to it at all. Wow.
They don't see the benefits.
That's amazing that they're still punished. That's
so, sure.
I mean, that is such a throwback to colonial.
Yeah. Yeah. Where they don't punish outrightly, at least they are discouraged.
Yeah.
You still see signposts in different places saying, speak English. This is the gateway to success and things like that.
That's so sad.
So these negative attitudes, I mean, I could even talk about situations where you see people are shy or ashamed to speak their local language because they are either mocked by their peers, or, when I was growing up, and I don't think that has changed a lot, you see people would mock someone because they had their indigenous language accent in English or in Pidgin English.
Yeah.
And their mates will mock at them, and so to say that these constraints, there are so many constraints on many African languages, especially the little known ones, including Kejom, and if these languages are surviving, some of these little languages are still managing to survive, I think it's only due to the bravery of the speakers.
Yeah.
Who in spite of all these odds are holding on to their ancestry codes and making efforts to transmit what they can to future generations. But the situation overall is not as positive as one would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of my other questions was, I've seen this before just in my own interest in endangered languages, that there are people who argue that the preservation of endangered languages is a waste of time and resources. And and then of course there's the attitudes that you were just talking about that have stemmed from colonialism. And so where people even get to the point where they feel shame about speaking their own language. And so I'm curious why you personally, what is it that still makes you feel that it's important? What does it mean to you personally to preserve these languages?
Well, everyone has a right to their opinion, and of course this is understandable. People say it's a waste of time and resources to preserve endangered languages. People have different perspectives. Maybe my perspective, my thoughts are influenced by the fact that I'm a linguist and a speaker of an endangered language. And that's why I think it's important. Maybe so I can blame someone who thinks it's not important.
Yeah.
But I think, unfortunately, among the people who think that preserving endangered languages is a waste of time and resources are like politicians, government officials. There are, unfortunately, even some speakers of some endangered languages, and to some extent, even linguists. There are some linguists who think that this is a waste of time, especially there are people who do. Well, I don't want to go, but I think there are some linguists who think that it's also a waste of time for reasons that we shouldn't go into. In some countries where the former colonial languages, like English and French, Portuguese, Spanish, etc., are official languages, the governments and politicians, as I mentioned before, they think that it is more economical to invest in the promotion of these colonial languages than in the promotion of the local languages, which in their opinion may also be used to consolidate national unity. You hear these kinds of arguments come up. So such governments, especially in the African context, of which I can speak, do not invest in the preservation of endangered languages, and because they think it's cheaper to use these colonial languages in education, even if in the end we know from research that using foreign languages in education does not work in favor of young learners, and it says a lot about the African continent. And again, as I said, unfortunately, many speakers of endangered languages think that they also think it's a waste of time. Like people wonder why they should encourage their children maybe to make an effort to speak a language that is not, and I think I mentioned this earlier, if the language is not economically, educationally, politically useful, why get people to pay attention to it? And so you, as a linguist, I could only spend time to try to explain why I think it's useful, and I'll come back to this. But also, as I said, you see linguists who work, maybe linguists who work on languages in countries where there are several languages, like in Cameroon, where there are more than 300 languages, or in in Nigeria with more than 500 languages. A linguist could wonder why it's necessary to try to preserve those little ones, but in my opinion, promoting endangered languages can be seen as a matter of respect of linguistic rights, just like we respect human rights.
Yeah.
We should give a chance to all languages to survive.
Yeah.
And one thing to consider is that in many cases, it's not the fault of some of these languages that they are endangered. As we've mentioned, it could be the fallout of several factors, including colonialism, which we've talked about before. But it's not even about establishing responsibility at this point that matters. But I think we cannot stand by and watch languages die. Like humanity doesn't do that. Humanity doesn't have the habit of standing by and watching death happen. We can draw inspiration from what happened recently or is still even happening with COVID-19. You see all the efforts that have been made in recent years to find a way out of the virus. We cannot afford to and should not abandon endangered languages, which can be seen as sick languages. We cannot just say, oh, these ones don't matter, we shouldn't invest in them. And part of the reason is that we often talk about linguistic and cultural diversity, right? Many endangered languages have rich oral cultures and stories, songs, histories that are passed on to younger generations orally. And if we allow this to die, we know that with the extinction of a language, an entire culture is lost. And we have no chance to get back this kind of diversity, the kind of linguistic and cultural diversity we may like to have in our world. It's you see it's part of the agenda of so many organizations worldwide. UNESCO, for example, talking about linguistic and cultural diversity. But if at the same time you allow languages to die away with the cultures embedded in them, then what kind of diversity are we talking about? Just maybe animal, plant diversity, Linguistic diversity is so important because, of the cultural component of it.
I love that. I've never had anyone articulate it in quite that way, and I think it's I think it really illustrates in a way that I haven't heard before. How important it is. Just like you would try to save a single life, because of the history, and you wouldn't value, another life over that one. The language is the same. That's really beautiful.
Exactly.
And so one of the things that I found when I was looking online is you had an article, or I found something where it's mentioned something about ritual speech, and you talked earlier about stories that are no longer being told, and in what I read, the little that was available online, you spoke about ritual language and how it's different from everyday speech. And I was really fascinated by that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think this hasn't been written up as an article or something. I think it was a project, documentation project. A documentation project that was funded by the Endangered Languages Program, ELDP. Yeah, the thing with ritual speech, as I conceptualized at that time, well, yeah, as you know, language is not used language is used in specific ways, like depending on the particular communicative context or particular purpose for which it is spoken. So each language has specific registers, okay, that is language as used in some particular communicative context or for some particular purpose. And this is the case with rituals in every language. So even if the register of rituals is not significantly different from the ordinary language, there will always be some specificities.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I
Yeah.
hadn't, like I think about English and it seems like the language
yeah,
is basically
English
the
has
same,
various.
but I guess it's not something I've never really delved into, so.
Well, English has specific registers also depending on the communicative context. Yeah.
Okay.
But maybe the way to look at rituals is that they are unique in having a specific purpose, specific actors, specific audience, maybe specific tools or instruments that are used depending on the ritual we are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it makes sense that there should be some special way of using language during each performance.
Yeah.
And in that project, when I tried to document the language of rituals, that was the context where I observed a lot of poetic language. There were lots of proverbs. There were many incantations. There were lots of songs. Mm-hmm. Just specific things that you would find only in the context of some specific ritual.
Yeah, okay.
That even if someone speaks the language, they may not have an opportunity to come in contact with that particular language outside of that context.
Okay.
And this was just, and you'd, and this is understandable because the language or message in rituals is not for everyone. Thinking like you have a birth ritual or a death-related ritual, maybe for a death-related ritual that will come out very clearly where, there are some specific things that are done and said maybe before someone is buried. Mm-hmm. These are things that you will not hear out of that context, right? Mm-hmm. In the Babanki context, in the Kajam context, there are specific things that are done, specific rituals that are performed before a corpse is buried. Yeah, it's maybe just some particular people can do those things, and they have specific things that they say, and there are some particular people who cannot even witness those the rituals related to death and so on. Mm-hmm. And there are specific songs, there are specific dances that are performed only during that situation and that context. And so to me, what I would say, which I find unfortunate about these rituals and the language involved, is that many of them are no longer performed in the Kajam context.
Yeah.
And part of the problem is the colonialism and modernity, which we mentioned earlier, and in particular Christianity, which has done a lot of harm in that regard in over the years, over the many decades, trying to convince people that those rituals are actually primitive, or in the worst case, pagan, so negative that people are encouraged to abandon them. People are expected to abandon them in order to be civilized or to be good Christians and so on. Mm-hmm. And once these are abandoned, the next problem is that the cultural practices are no longer transmitted. They are just abandoned. Yeah. And that language, those activities that can only be performed during those rituals, of course, are lost. Yeah, it's such a shame that someone will feel so superior and will go to the extent of declaring another person's culture as primitive.
Yeah.
Then at the same time turn around to talk of promoting cultural and linguistic diversity, as we're saying.
Yeah.
And I think personally, as the debate about compensation for colonialism intensifies, we saw this in the recent UN summit. There was a lot of talk about compensation for colonialism and so on. As this debate intensifies, I think issues of language and culture should be raised and discussed as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like, you were talking about how it's not just a matter of convenience that, it's easier to make everything run smoothly if it's all done in one language. But, I mean, it's been used for centuries, this tactic of making people feel shame for where they come from, to the point.
Guilt. Feel guilt.
Guilt and shame about who they are. And so then, this brings me back to the question of, why do you feel it's important? It's important for people to feel pride at who they are, at who their culture is and where they come from, and that connection to their ancestors and the land that they've lived on for centuries,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, this is I guess this is my final question, if I manage to not get sidetracked. What are you're a linguist, and you obviously have a personal connection to the work that you do. What are some of the ways that you're actively working right now to preserve and revitalize the language?
I think, like many people, I would like to do more, and but since it's a question about what I've done so far, I could just point to the fact that I've at least been doing some documentation and description of various aspects of the Babanki language, the Kejom language. I've done quite some documentation and quite a bit of description, so that it's not the best thing, but we always think that if the language eventually dies, which I hope will not happen to Kejom, because we are making lots of efforts to revitalize. At least there will be things that people can turn to and remember how the language was spoken. And in terms of the efforts to revitalize, also I try to be present in the kind of social media space where I find many Kejom people.
Okay.
We currently have a WhatsApp group of more than 1,000 Kejom people. It's small compared to the number of people that should normally that are recognized recognized as Kejom, which, as I said earlier, is at least 20,000. So a group of 1,000 is not large, but it's somewhere. It's a place to begin.
Yeah.
And in that group, we make every effort to speak Kejom. And I find this important because so many people appreciate it. So many people make the efforts to speak, which is something that is actually been lost. So just the fact that in that group we encourage speaking, and we encourage people to actually share whatever they can in the language, some cultural aspects, every now and then people stage things that used to happen and reenact them in this group. I think little gestures like that are helping, because I say this because the kind of scientific work that I mentioned earlier, doing documentation and description, is not something that is actually useful to the Kejom person at this point in time. Because, I mean, no, I don't expect, and I don't think Kejom people read the articles, the journal articles or books, have a grammar of the language that I've written. But this is of no interest to the Kejom person who who is also of the oral culture. You know, people not go looking for a linguistic book or article to read. It doesn't just happen. But the things on social media, at least we think that a few people watch, a few people listen. And so this is more, quite important. Also, for several years, I've had this project trying to run a Babanki English medium school in the Kajam community.
Oh, fantastic.
And this is one of the things that I think stands out as a place where we don't discourage children from speaking the language. We don't punish them for speaking their language. Because we know that if they are allowed to speak in their language, to build self-confidence in their language, this will only go a long way to encourage and facilitate and make learning fun to these children.
Yeah. And psychologically, I feel like it would have such a huge benefit, too, to just have a space where they're allowed to feel pride about...
Exactly. That's not like great. What I experienced when I was in school. I mean, that generation where it was forbidden. It was just outrightly forbidden for us to speak Kajam on the school compound, and speaking came with lots of corporal punishment and things like that. So it was quite traumatizing.
I'm curious, was the teachers who were enforcing this, were they Kajam people or were they foreign
teachers?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so there's that self-hatred
a mix,
happening
a mix. But I mean, this is something that cut across Africa and even beyond in many parts of the world. This was part of the colonial agenda. To make people hate what was theirs, and to embrace English or French or Spanish or Portuguese, and any other thing was not tolerated. Any other thing was not tolerated, and the agents of this were the teachers. Even if they were of that same language, they would. I mean, it's not like. At that point, those teachers, the people who were enforcing this, didn't think that they were doing anything wrong. They didn't think they were wicked. They were just trying to do what they had been told was best. You know. So I think the maybe one more thing that I try to do to try to revitalize the language is I've had the possibility to at least train a few community members to be involved in documentation of the language. The kind of auto documentation where you don't need sophisticated materials to document a language. Just using a cell phone, you can record things, you can create video records of things of particular, and it doesn't have to be professional in any way, just using what you have to capture the language as it is used in that particular time and space, and sharing this with people who can relate with it. And finding raising interest in community members to do this kind of documentation has proven to be helpful.
Absolutely.
So,
I love that idea. And it reminds me of another project that I saw. This was actually in the UK called the Nest Collective, where they encourage just everyday people, not scientists, not linguists, to go out. This is specifically for songs, and maybe poetry, I'm not sure, to record that material from the elders around the country. And it gives people such a sense of purpose as well as pride,
This approach, this auto documentation approach, has been promoted here at my lab, LLACAN, by Amina Mitucci, which is a linguist of the Berber languages and cultures in North Africa, and she started this whole process of auto documentation, and and we see it working, and a lot is done when people take documentation into their hands and do it with what is available to them.
Yeah.
So it's helpful.
That's fantastic.
There are just so many languages that if you expect linguists to do professional documentation over the years, it will take a lot of time for us to get anywhere.
Yeah.
So getting people to do it themselves, it's also part of revitalization, because when people find value in their language, they find pride in their language and do what they can to promote that language, it's better than when an outsider is doing it or telling them to do whatsoever.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh yeah, thank you too.
Sharing this time and letting us know what you're doing. I find it really inspiring. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
It's my pleasure to share. I mean, we don't always have the opportunity to talk about what we're doing, and it's like the little we do stays in the little corners where we are.
Yeah.
And so this is an opportunity for me to share. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back next Monday. Tune in.